Right now, somewhere in the world, there is a brilliant musician just staring blankly at an Excel spreadsheet.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And they are entirely convinced that tuning their guitar, which is just, sitting right there in the corner of the room, is just this frivolous waste of time.
Yeah, a total distraction.
Exactly. And I mean, we all do some version of this, don't we? We quietly pack our greatest passions, our grandest ambitions into these cardboard boxes, slide them under the bed, and tell ourselves we are just being practical.
We convince ourselves that adulthood is pretty much synonymous with giving up on what we really want.
Yes, like adulthood is just the abandonment of aspiration and the tension between the life you dream about and the life you actually live, paying the utility bills, meeting the deadlines, satisfying the landlord. It is this heavy, completely invisible tug of war.
And we are engaged in it every single day.
Every single day. So to get to the absolute bottom of that friction today, we are doing a deep dive into a deeply unconventional piece of source material.
Which I find so fascinating.
Right, because we aren't dissecting some sprawling 1,000-page psychological study from a university.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, exactly. And we aren't analyzing a dense philosophical text. The source today is deceptively simple. It is literally an English podcast learning guide.
A study guide for language learners.
Yes, a study guide carrying the very provocative title, Are You Living Your Dreams?
And, the utility of a source like this really cannot be overstated.
How do you mean?
Well, language learning guides operate under a very strict constraint. They must distill incredibly complex, nuanced human experiences into their absolute purest, most fundamental building blocks.
Because they have to teach the language.
Right. They do not have the luxury of hiding behind academic jargon or, labyrinthine theories. They are forced to explain the human condition using baseline vocabulary.
Wow, yeah.
So by examining the precise words, the grammatical structures, and the conversational prompts this specific guide uses, we uncover a remarkably clear psychological roadmap.
It's totally unpretentious.
Exactly. It strips away all that intellectualizing we usually do when we talk about our failed dreams, and it leaves us with this raw blueprint for balancing reality with aspiration.
And that stripping away of jargon, that is our mission for this deep dive. We are going to use this guide summary, its curated vocabulary, and its specific practice exercises to really dissect the mechanical reasons we abandon our goals.
The nuts and bolts of giving up.
Yeah. We're going to look at the insidious role of societal pressure and ultimately figure out how to build a sustainable bridge between our passions and our practical realities.
Which is what everyone is looking for.
Right. So let's look at how the guide sets the stage in its podcast summary section. It doesn't list like 100 reasons why people give up. It isolates 3 distinct, massive roadblocks: practicality, fear, and a sense of obligation.
And I think it's crucial to note that those 3 terms are not just interchangeable synonyms for giving up.
They aren't.
No, not at all. They represent 3 fundamentally different mechanisms of surrender. If we break them down, we actually see this hierarchy of resistance.
Okay, lay it out for me.
So the first one, practicality. That is the cold, unforgiving math of survival.
The spreadsheet.
The spreadsheet. It is the realization that a passion for, say, writing avant-garde poetry does not generate the capital required to purchase groceries or pay rent.
Sadly, no.
Right. Practicality is the barrier of the physical material world. It is an external constraint.
Literally, the math looking at you and determining that your passion has a 0% return on investment.
Precisely that. But then the second roadblock the text identifies fear, which it later specifically calls fear of failure. That operates entirely differently.
Because it's an internal thing.
Exactly. Unlike practicality, fear is a completely internal psychological barrier. It is this paralyzing anxiety regarding your own competence.
The imposter syndrome.
Right. It is a neurological response that treats a bruised ego or a failed creative project as a literal survival threat. And what makes fear so incredibly dangerous is its camouflage.
Wait, what do you mean by camouflage?
Well, fear constantly disguises itself as logic. It borrows the language of practicality to convince you that abandoning your goal is just the reasonable thing to do.
Oh, wow. Like your brain saying, oh, I shouldn't start this business because the market is saturated, when the truth is actually, I shouldn't start this business because if it fails, I will feel completely worthless.
That is the exact translation. You're hiding behind the math to protect your ego.
That is so common. Okay, so what about the third one? Obligation.
Right, the sense of obligation. This shifts the barrier from the internal back to the interpersonal. The guide directly links this to societal pressures.
The expectations of other people.
Exactly. This is the evolutionary weight of the tribe. Anthropologically, humans are wired to prioritize the cohesion of the group over the self-actualization of the individual.
Because if you didn't fit in back then, you died.
Historically, yes, being exiled from the group meant death. So today, that translates into this intense pressure to meet the expectations of your parents, your spouse, or just your culture's general definition of success.
So you abandon the dream not because the math is impossible,
Right.
and not because you lack internal courage, but because pursuing it would disrupt the social harmony you depend on.
Exactly. You don't want to rock the boat.
So we have the math of survival, the internal paralysis of the ego, and the evolutionary pressure of the tribe. I mean, that is a brutal gauntlet.
It's a miracle anyone ever pursues a dream at all.
Seriously. But looking at the way the guide frames this, I have to push back a little on the premise of abandonment.
Oh, how so?
Well, are we genuinely discarding these dreams?
Hmm.
Because the word abandon implies a permanent conscious termination. You throw it away and never look back. I don't think that's what actually happens.
What do you think happens?
It feels more like we are adjusting the pressure in a submarine.
Okay, I like this.
Not-
Tell me more about the submarine.
Think about it this way. The external water pressure pushing down on the hull of the submarine, that is practicality, that is obligation.
The weight of the world.
Yeah, it is heavy, it is constant, and it will literally crush you if you ignore it. Now, your passions, your dreams, those are the internal air pressure pushing back out against the hull, keeping the structure intact.
Right, giving you a sense of purpose.
Exactly. So when the external pressure gets too intense, say, you have a child or you suddenly lose a job, you have to compartmentalize.
You seal off the hatches.
Yes. You seal off certain rooms in the submarine just to survive the dive. You aren't abandoning the internal oxygen. You are just redistributing it so the hull doesn't implode.
That makes perfect sense.
But the problem is, if you stay too deep for too long and you seal off too many rooms, you eventually suffocate.
Yes.
So I really want you, the listener, to evaluate your own submarine right now. Like, take a second. Which of those three forces, the cold math, the internal fear, or the tribal obligation, is currently dictating your depth?
And the real danger of that compartmentalization, to use your metaphor, is that people forget how to unseal the doors once the external pressure normalizes.
Oh, that's tragic.
It is. The temporary survival tactic just becomes a permanent state of being. You just get used to living in the dark.
So the question then becomes, if the external pressure of adulthood is just a permanent reality, how do we maintain the internal oxygen without imploding?
And this leads us directly to the text's proposed solution.
Which, frankly, annoyed me at first glance.
Really? Why?
Because it feels so incredibly countercultural. The guide explicitly asserts that, quote, you don't need to make drastic changes to stay connected to your passions.
Right.
It lays out the central thesis that balance is key. Neither extreme indulgence nor complete abandonment is healthy.
Which is a remarkably sober assessment.
It is, but consider the culture we live in right now. We absolutely fetishize the drastic change narrative.
We really do.
We are addicted to the whole burn the boats philosophy. I mean, the viral stories online are always about the person who dramatically quits their soul-crushing corporate job on a total whim.
Sells all their earthly possessions.
Right. Sells their car, moves to a cabin in the woods, and becomes a full-time ceramicist. We idolize the grand cinematic gesture of blowing up your life for a passion.
The romantic leap into the unknown.
Exactly. So in the face of that incredibly romantic narrative, this guide's insistence on balance and no drastic changes, it feels, I don't know, like settling.
That's compromise.
It feels like a corporate HR pamphlet telling you to just enjoy your little weekend hobbies and get back to work on Monday.
I see the temptation to view it that way.
Okay.
I really do. But the cultural obsession with the grand gesture is a massive case of survivor bias.
Survivor bias.
Absolutely. We only hear about the ceramicist in the woods because they succeeded, or at least they had the resources to make an aesthetic Instagram account about it.
Fair point.
We do not see the thousands of people who burn their boats only to realize they were stranded on an island with no food, no shelter, and a profound sense of panic.
The people who leaped in the net did not appear.
Exactly. So the text is not advocating for a boring compromise. It is advocating for a strategic defense mechanism based on human psychology.
But doesn't sometimes breaking a toxic cycle of obligation require a drastic, violent rupture? I mean, if the external pressure is crushing you, moderation won't save you. You have to surface immediately.
Well, in acute crises, yes, drastic action is entirely necessary. If your submarine is actively flooding, you blow the ballast. But the guide is addressing the chronic condition of adulthood, not the acute crisis.
Okay, the day-to-day reality.
Right. Let's analyze the danger of the extremes the source warns against. Extreme indulgence in a passion, severing all practicalities and obligations. That is the romantic leap you described.
It's a ceramicist.
Yes. For the vast majority of human beings, extreme indulgence leads to catastrophic ruin.
Financial ruin, mostly.
Financial ruin, bankruptcy, the severing of vital relationships. And what people don't realize is that it causes a massive spike in cortisol and stress that completely paralyzes the very creativity you sacrificed everything to pursue.
Wow. Wait, that's such a good point.
You cannot paint a masterpiece when you are terrified of eviction. Your brain literally won't allow the creative flow state because it's too busy managing the fear of starvation.
So the romanticizing of the starving artist is basically a myth created by people who aren't actually starving.
Exactly the point. Extreme indulgence is biologically and financially unsustainable. However, the text is equally critical of the opposite end of the spectrum.
Complete abandonment.
Complete abandonment. If you seal off all the doors in the submarine in the name of total practicality, it inevitably breeds a slow-burning, toxic resentment.
You start hating your spreadsheet.
You hate the spreadsheet, you hate your boss. You might even start resenting your family if you blame them for your obligations. You become bitter, hyper-cynical, and emotionally hollowed out.
So you survive, but the quality of that survival is just miserable.
Precisely. And this is why the text introduces the concept of moderation, not as a surrender, but as the only sustainable architecture for a dream.
It's funny, the guide's example sentence for moderation in the vocabulary section is almost comically mundane.
What is it?
It says, he enjoys sweets in moderation to stay healthy.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Just completely stripped of all romance.
But the mundanity is the entire point. Moderation is the strategic management of compounding small efforts.
Compounding small efforts. I like that.
The guide is arguing that you do not need to detonate your entire life to be an artist. You can be an accountant who aggressively defends 2 hours of uninterrupted painting time every Sunday morning.
So you don't quit the job.
No, that is not a failure of ambition. It is a fortress. Moderation protects your passion from the crushing reality of the math, while simultaneously protecting your material livelihood from the chaos of unchecked impulse.
So moderation is essentially the immune system that keeps both the dream and the body alive.
That's a great way to phrase it.
All right, so if that is the strategy, what are the actual tactical tools to execute it? The guide provides what it calls a vocabulary for reflection and courage list.
Right.
But if you look past the basic definitions, it isn't a vocabulary list at all. It is a highly sequential psychological toolkit.
It really is.
It charts a specific cognitive path, starting with the inner world. The first words are introspection, passion, and life choices.
And the deliberate sequencing here is vital. Look at the example sentences the guide provides.
Wow.
For introspection, which it defines as the careful examination of your thoughts and feelings, the example is, through introspection, she realized her true passion was painting.
Okay, so she had to look inward first.
Exactly. And then for life choices, the example is, she reflects on her life choices before making any big moves.
Oh, I see. The text is establishing an absolute prerequisite here.
Yes.
It positions introspection as the mandatory gatekeeper to discovering passion. Like, you cannot hack your way into a meaningful life.
No shortcuts.
And you certainly cannot make sound life choices, the decisions that actually shape your external reality, without first managing the cognitive load of internal examination.
Furthermore, introspection is how you identify whether a desire is genuinely yours or just an inherited obligation masquerading as a dream.
Oh, wait. An obligation masquerading as a dream. Give me an example.
Sure. Like the person who spends 10 years trying to become a lawyer because they think it's their dream, but through introspection, they realize it was actually just their parents' definition of success.
Wow, yeah.
Without that careful examination, you risk burning your boats for a destination you don't even actually want to reach. The text is demanding that before you alter your reality, you must map your internal landscape.
Which makes the next group of words in the guide incredibly sobering.
Oh, so?
Because once we map the internal landscape, the vocabulary list forces us to confront the roadblocks. We have fear of failure and practicality.
Ah, right.
And the example sentence for practicality struck me as really profound. It says, she chose practicality over passion when picking her career. Oof, right? The author of this guide did not write, she successfully synergized her practicality and passion. They wrote that she chose one over the other. That sentence carries an immense amount of grief.
It does. It absolutely acknowledges the mourning process inherent in adulthood.
It frames choosing practicality as a heavy, sacrificial act. It implies that at a certain juncture, the two forces are in direct zero-sum opposition.
You can't have both in that specific moment.
Right. And that forces a question about the underlying philosophy of this guide. Is practicality fundamentally the enemy of passion, or is it just a very strict manager?
Well, based on the guide's overarching thesis of balance, practicality cannot be the enemy.
Why not?
If practicality is the enemy, then reality itself is the enemy, and that is a one-way ticket to delusion.
Fair point.
The example sentence, choosing practicality over career passion, is an acknowledgement that sometimes the math simply does not compute.
You can't pay the rent with a poem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to take the accounting job because you have dependents. Practicality is the scaffolding that keeps the building from collapsing.
So it's essential.
It is.
Right.
The tragedy, as the text implies, only occurs when the scaffolding becomes a cage.
Oh, that's a powerful image.
When practicality transitions from managing your survival to tyrannically banishing every trace of passion from your existence, that's when it becomes a problem.
So if tyrannical practicality and the fear of failure are the poisons, the final words in this vocabulary section are the antidotes.
Right. Courage and small steps.
Yes. And the guide fundamentally redefines courage here.
It really does.
It defines it as the ability to face challenges despite fear, with the example. It takes courage to follow your dreams, even when it seems risky, but then it immediately pairs it with small steps, taking gradual actions toward a goal.
And this is a critical psychological pivot.
How do you mean?
When society talks about courage, we always envision the monumental leap.
The cinematic moment.
Exactly. The knight charging the dragon. The whistleblower risking everything to expose the truth. But courage, in the context of maintaining a passion within the constraints of adulthood, is remarkably quiet.
Doesn't look heroic.
No. It is the neuroplastic resilience to maintain focus on a distant goal despite daily exhaustion.
The courage to keep the internal oxygen flowing when every external force is screaming at you to just seal the door and go to sleep.
Precisely. Courage is not quitting the job on a Tuesday. Courage is the discipline to wake up 45 minutes early to write a single page of a novel, day after day, year after year, fully knowing it might never be published.
Wow.
It is the tolerance of the vulnerability inherent in taking a small step.
So if these words are the cognitive tools, the next section of the guide transforms them into actionable philosophies.
The key expressions.
Right. The section is titled Key Expressions and Phrases, but they function much more like daily cognitive behavioral mantras for walking this middle path.
Mantras are a great way to think about it.
We have phrases like, follow your dreams without losing yourself, balance your responsibilities with your passions, and reflect on your priorities.
The phrasing, without losing yourself, warrants some deep analysis here.
Let's do it.
The common cultural interpretation of don't lose yourself is usually a warning against allowing wealth or fame to corrupt your core identity.
Like, remember where you came from.
Exactly. But in the context of balancing practicality and passion, it means something entirely different.
It seems to point toward the concept of identity tethering.
Yes. Explain that a bit more.
Well, when people say, I lost myself in my work, they mean their identity became entirely consumed by their practical responsibilities, their output, their daily grind.
They became the spreadsheet.
They became the spreadsheet. But you can equally lose yourself in the fantasy of the dream, becoming so detached from your material obligations that your life actually falls apart.
And that dual threat is exactly what the phrase addresses. To not lose yourself means to maintain your center of gravity amidst two incredibly powerful gravitational pulls.
The pull of the grind and the pull of the clouds.
Exactly. If you surrender entirely to the daily grind, you lose the essence of what makes you an individual. You become merely a function of your obligations.
A cog in the machine.
Right. But if you surrender entirely to the dream without regard for reality, you lose your grounding. You become chaotic and unreliable.
So the mantra is a daily reminder to keep one foot firmly planted in the material world and the other in the realm of aspiration.
A perfect balance.
But how do these colloquialisms actually alter behavior? I mean, if you are a listener staring at that Excel spreadsheet right now, how does a phrase like take it one step at a time functionally help you?
It sounds a bit cliche on the surface.
It does. The guide defines this as encouraging gradual progress. But beyond just being nice encouragement, I think it acts as a mechanism to shrink the cognitive load.
Okay, I'm back then.
When you are totally exhausted at the end of a long day, the idea of following your dream feels insurmountable. The brain perceives the gap between your current reality and the realization of the massive dream as just too big, and that triggers a stress response.
And that is actually the neuroscience of task breakdown.
Really?
Yes, when a goal is too large and abstract, the brain's dopamine reward prediction error basically fails to activate.
Oh, interesting.
You look at the mountain. Your brain calculates the immense energy required to climb it, determines you have insufficient resources, and then floods your system with cortisol.
Telling you to run away.
Exactly. Urging you to abandon the task and seek immediate, low-effort comfort.
Like endlessly scrolling through social media.
Exactly like that.
The mountain is too big, so you just turn on the TV.
But if your operating mantra is literally take it one step at a time, you are manually overriding that stress response.
Because the goal isn't to write the whole book today.
Right. The goal is just to open the document and type one sentence. You shrink the dragon down to the size of a lizard so your brain actually believes it can win the fight.
That is so practical. By lowering the activation energy required to engage with the passion, you bypass the amygdala's fear response.
You trick your brain into taking action by making the action ridiculously small.
Okay, so up to this point, the guide has been relatively gentle, I would say.
Very accommodating.
Yeah. It gave us the mechanisms, the vocabulary, the nice mantras. But the next section fundamentally shifts the dynamic.
It gets intense.
It moves from instruction to interrogation. The discussion questions section doesn't want you to just memorize words.
Yeah.
It demands that you synthesize everything and apply it to your own life.
It is an inquisition.
It really is. And I want to turn these 4 specific prompts outward and challenge you, the listener, right now.
The structural design of these 4 questions is completely masterful, by the way.
How so?
They escalate in a very specific sequence that mimics the stages of cognitive behavioral therapy.
Wow. Okay, let's look at the sequence.
Sure.
Question 1 asks, what are your biggest dreams or goals in life? Are you currently pursuing them?
Okay, start there.
Then question 2, have you ever chosen practicality over passion? How did it feel?
Getting deeper.
Question 3, describe a time when fear prevented you from taking action. How could courage have helped?
Ouch.
And finally, question 4, how do you personally balance your responsibilities with your interests?
See, the escalation is brilliant. Question 1 forces you to articulate the abstract ideal, identifying the internal oxygen, going back to your submarine.
Right, acknowledging that you even have a dream.
But the second half of that prompt, are you currently pursuing them? That is the reality check.
It stings.
It immediately forces the learner to confront the delta between their desired identity and their current behavioral reality. Are you actually doing the thing you say you want to do?
And then question 2 is just brutal. Have you ever chosen practicality over passion? How did it feel?
Right.
This isn't an academic exercise anymore. It is forcing you to confront the somatic bodily experience of abandoning a piece of yourself.
The physical sensation of giving up.
I really want everyone listening to actually sit with that for a second. Think about a time you took the safe job instead of the risky one that excited you.
Or think about a time you put down an instrument or stopped writing because someone told you it wasn't productive.
Or monetizable.
Right.
How did it actually feel in your body to make that choice? The author of this guide included that follow-up question for a very specific reason.
They included it to force the acknowledgement of grief.
Grief.
Yes. As we discussed earlier, prioritizing practicality is often necessary for survival. You have to eat. But necessity does not negate the emotional cost.
Just because it was the right choice doesn't mean it didn't hurt.
Exactly. The text is forcing us to acknowledge that letting practicality completely extinguish a passion leaves a psychological scar. It feels heavy. It feels like a diminishment of self.
It hurts.
By asking how did it feel, the guide requires the learner to stop rationalizing the abandonment as purely logical and actually sit with the emotional fallout of that choice.
Because you cannot begin to fix the balance until you admit that the imbalance is causing you pain.
Precisely.
Which makes question 3 so important. It asks you to identify the invisible enemy in retrospect. Describe a time when fear prevented you from taking action.
Notice how it separates fear from practicality.
Yes. It demands that you look back at a missed opportunity and admit that the math wasn't the problem. your own internal paralysis was.
You can't blame the spreadsheet for this one.
No, you have to blame yourself. And by asking, how could courage have helped? It does something really interesting.
It introduces the concept of retrospective neuroplasticity.
Retrospective neuroplasticity, what does that mean in plain English?
It means that by vividly imagining how a small step of courage could have altered a past outcome, you actually prime your brain to recognize the utility of courage in future scenarios.
So you are basically rehearsing the courageous response.
Exactly. You're building the neural pathway for next time.
Which perfectly sets up the final demand in question 4. How do you personally balance your responsibilities with your interests?
It moves from the past to the present.
Right. It is no longer about past grief or abstract dreams. It demands a current localized system. It says, you know the pain of abandonment. You know the mechanics of fear. Now what is your actual architectural plan for the submarine today?
And that transition from theory to localized system brings us to the most critical part of the entire text,
The grand finale.
the mini-activity suggestions. This is where all that philosophical heavy lifting translates into physical mechanics.
This is the engine room of the guide. It provides 3 specific frameworks for taking these abstract concepts and forcing them into reality.
Let's break them down.
The first activity is a journaling exercise, and the prompt is highly, highly restrictive.
Tell me.
It says, write exactly 5 sentences about one dream, use at least 3 vocabulary words, and identify exactly one small step you can take this week.
The psychology of constraint is operating at full capacity here.
Constraint is the magic word.
Because when humans contemplate their unmet aspirations, they tend to think in these massive, nebulous, overwhelming terms.
Like, I want to be a financially independent filmmaker who wins an Oscar.
Right. And the sheer scale of that thought breeds intense anxiety, which immediately feeds the fear of failure we dissected earlier.
The brain just short circuits.
But the guide artificially limits the playing field. 5 sentences, 3 words, 1 step.
That limitation is almost an act of mercy.
It is. It prevents information overload. It forces the grand, terrifying abstraction of the dream out of the clouds and compresses it into a concrete, immediate, and highly manageable parameter.
Yeah, grounds it.
And by demanding exactly 1 actionable step for the current week, it completely eliminates the excuse of needing a comprehensive 10-year plan before you can even begin.
It neutralizes the perfectionism that always masquerades as procrastination.
Oh, perfectly said.
You aren't drafting a manifesto, you are writing 5 sentences. You can do that on a napkin while waiting for a train.
Right.
It entirely obliterates the defense mechanism of, oh, I just don't have enough time.
Which brings us to the second activity. This one shifts the mechanism from internal constraint to external articulation.
The role-playing conversation.
Yes. One person plays an advisor discussing how to balance dreams and responsibilities, while the other person explains their specific personal situation, utilizing at least 2 key expressions.
This is cognitive offloading in its purest form.
It really is.
When you are trapped inside your own head, the tangle of societal pressures, financial fears, and personal ambitions feels like an insurmountable, knotted mess.
Because you can't see all the pieces at once.
Right. The threat feels omnipotent because it is undefined. But the moment you are forced to sit across from another human being and audibly articulate the specific mechanics of your situation, like, I cannot find 2 hours to paint because my commute is too long and my family expects me to be available every evening, you demystify the fear.
You give it shape.
You pull the monster out from under the bed and force it to stand under fluorescent lighting.
And scientifically, the act of verbalization engages the prefrontal cortex, forcing you to organize emotional chaos into logical, linear language.
You can't speak a tangled mess.
Exactly. You must unravel it to communicate it to someone else. And simultaneously, the person playing the role of the advisor is engaging in a powerful psychological mirroring technique.
Oh, this is my favorite part. Because by offering objective moderation to someone else, using phrases like, take it 1 step at a time, they are practicing the exact advice they desperately need to internalize for themselves.
It's a brilliant trick.
Right. We are notoriously terrible at solving our own emotional problems because we are just blinded by our proximity to them.
We're too close to the canvas.
But by playing the advisor, you gain the psychological distance required to see the structural simplicity of this solution.
Which naturally brings us to the absolute climax of this document,
The final activity.
the action plan chart.
Yes, it is a 3-column matrix that essentially visually maps the entire philosophy of the guide.
Let's walk through the columns.
Okay, column 1 is titled Passion Dream Goals. Column 2 is Responsibilities, Practical Needs. And column 3 is Small Steps to Balance Both.
This chart is the visual manifestation of a unified theory of adulthood.
A unified theory. I love that.
Truly. Because if we analyze how people traditionally operate, we see exactly why failure and resentment are so incredibly common.
Right, because the vast majority of adults live their entire existence solely within the confines of column 2.
The responsibilities.
Yes, they become absolute masters of managing practical needs, fulfilling obligations, and paying bills, and eventually their entire identity becomes synonymous with their responsibilities.
They lose themselves in the grind.
And occasionally, usually during like a midlife crisis or a moment of profound exhaustion, they stare wistfully over the wall at column 1.
The dream.
They sigh at the impossibility of it all, and then they just return to the grind of column 2.
Or, conversely, they do the drastic leap. They burn the boats,
Yeah.
completely abandon column 2 to indulge in column 1, and end up destroying their lives because they ignored the math of survival.
So what this 3-column matrix does is revolutionary in its simplicity.
It refuses to let you erase column 2 to make room for column 1.
Exactly. It honors the absolute validity of both forces. It acknowledges that your desperate need to write music is profoundly real, and it simultaneously acknowledges that your need to pay your mortgage is equally real.
It places the passion and the practicality side by side as necessary equals in the ecosystem of your life.
And the genius is the introduction of column 3. Small steps to balance both.
Because column 3 is the bridge.
Yes.
Column 3 is the physical, actionable link between the reality of who you are and the aspiration of who you want to become.
It proves that moderation and gradual progress are not cop-outs.
Not at all. They are the only mechanisms capable of reconciling the opposing forces of human existence. Column 3 is where the actual living happens.
Column 3 is the deliberate adjustment of the submarine's pressure. It is the tactical execution of courage.
So what does column 3 actually look like in practice for someone listening?
Well, it is writing one single paragraph on the Notes app of your phone during your morning commute.
All right.
It is setting aside, $15 a week into a separate account for a photography class.
Small, manageable things.
It is having a fiercely difficult, uncomfortable conversation with your spouse about needing 45 minutes of uninterrupted, locked door time on a Saturday morning.
That takes real courage.
It does. Column 3 is the relentless defense of the small step.
Because without column 3, the tension between column 1 and column 2 will eventually tear a person apart.
The small step is the pressure release valve.
It absolutely is.
Taking a step back, it is staggering to look at the journey this simple, unassuming language guide has forced us to take today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We began by identifying the heavy, invisible backpack we all wear, the crushing trio of the cold math of practicality, the internal paralysis of the fear of failure, and the evolutionary weight of societal obligation.
And we explored how those forces drive us to either violently abandon our reality or quietly suffocate our aspirations.
Right. And then we dissected the cultural myth of the drastic, romantic leap.
Realizing that the solution is the infinitely more sustainable, though admittedly less glamorous, path of moderation.
We mapped a lexicon of self-discovery, establishing that introspection is the mandatory prerequisite to action.
And redefining courage not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to take a microscopic step while terrified.
We looked at cognitive mantras that tether us to reality without allowing us to lose our identity to the grind.
We confronted the somatic reality of the grief that comes from letting practicality extinguish a dream.
And ultimately, we arrived at a literal blueprint. A 3-column matrix that refuses to let us choose between survival and fulfillment, but demands that we do the hard, daily work of finding the small, manageable actions that build a bridge between the two.
It really is a profound psychological framework, just disguised as a vocabulary lesson.
It is.
It reminds us that the friction between reality and aspiration isn't a problem to be solved. It is a paradox to be managed.
A paradox to be managed. That brings us right back to the universal dilemma we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive.
That heavy tug of war.
The tug of war between the life you dream about and the life you live. That rope is always going to be there. The friction will never entirely disappear.
It's part of being human.
Exactly. But perhaps the goal of adulthood isn't to decisively win the tug of war. Maybe the goal is simply to find a grounded, sustainable posture while you hold your side of the line.
I think that's exactly it.
So I want to leave you with a final thought. Directly inspired by the source material's intense focus on reflection and the power of the small step.
Let's hear it.
The text demanded earlier that we reflect on a time when fear prevented us from taking action. I want you to think about one specific dream, just one, that you boxed up and shoved into the attic years ago because the unforgiving math of practicality demanded it.
Just pick one.
You do not have to quit your job tomorrow to resurrect it. You do not have to burn your boats or blow up your life. But based on the three-column blueprint we explored today, what is one singular microscopic step that you can put into column 3 this week?
Just one tiny thing.
What is the tiniest action you can take to prove to yourself that the dream isn't dead, but was merely waiting for a little bit of courage?
That really is the defining question, because the bridge between the life you have and the life you want is built entirely out of those microscopic steps.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We tailor these explorations specifically for you, the insanely curious learner, because we believe that uncovering these profound nuggets of insight in the most unexpected places, like a beginner's language study guide, is exactly what keeps that necessary spark of aspiration alive. Keep building out your column 3, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.